The courtroom fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. All eyes were on the black man standing before the bench, his appearance disheveled yet his posture unervingly straight. Judge West Bruce, notorious for his designer watches and cutting remarks, had spent the last 15 minutes tearing into him, mocking his stained jacket, his matted hair, the faint smell of the streets that clung to his clothes. "Mr. Bowens, if that's even your real name," Judge Bruce sneered, leaning back in his leather chair with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. "The only bar you're qualified for is the one at the bottom of a bottle. Vagrancy, public nuisance. You're exactly the kind of drain on society that this court exists to flush out." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff smirked. Even the court reporter couldn't hide a slight grin. But then Larry Bowens spoke. His voice was low, measured, and carried the weight of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "Your Honor, with all due respect, you've just violated my Fourth Amendment rights by denying me a fair hearing based on my appearance. Quod erat demonstrandum, which, for the record, means that which was to be demonstrated. I believe you've just demonstrated bias, prejudice, and a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law." The laughter died instantly. Judge Bruce's face flushed crimson. "Excuse me." Larry reached into the torn lining of his coat, slowly, deliberately, and produced a small device no larger than a pen. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "This, Your Honor, is a Class A recording device. For the past 45 minutes, it's been transmitting everything said in this courtroom to a secure server, including your conversation in the hallway this morning with developer Marcus Finch about clearing out the undesirables from the Henderson Street properties." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I object." The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face pale. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe this man is not who he claims to be. This is some kind of setup." Larry turned his calm gaze to the prosecutor and smiled faintly. "Your Honor, I can provide my credentials if necessary, but I assure you, every word I've spoken is not only legally sound, it's admissible in a federal racketeering investigation. Shall we continue, or would you prefer I read you your rights now?" Judge Bruce's hands gripped the edges of his bench, knuckles white. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Who are you?" Larry reached into his coat once more and pulled out a pristine leather credential case. He handed it to the bailiff, who carried it up to the bench with trembling hands. As Judge Bruce read the document inside, the color drained entirely from his face. His eyes went wide, his jaw slack. The courtroom held its breath. "My name," Larry said quietly, "is Lawrence Elijah Bowens, Esquire, former senior partner at Whitmore and Associates, member of the bar in 12 states. And for the past 6 months, I've been the ghost you never saw coming. Now let's go back to where it all began." The story started not in the gutters of downtown, but in the glass towers of Whitmore and Associates, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the nation. Lawrence "Larry" Bowens was a legend in those circles. At 42 years old, he had built a reputation as the fixer, the attorney you called when a billion-dollar merger was falling apart, when a CEO needed someone to clean up a scandal, when the impossible needed to become possible. He charged $1,000 an hour, and he was worth every penny. But Larry had always been haunted by a single question. Who was he helping? The corporations got richer. The powerful stayed powerful. And the people who actually needed justice, the single mothers, the elderly on fixed incomes, the veterans who'd given everything, they never even made it through his firm's lobby. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in March. Larry's former mentor, Judge Harold Chun, was found dead in his study. The official report called it a heart attack, but Larry knew better. Harold had called him 3 days earlier, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "Larry, I need your help. There's something happening in the housing court system. Something big. Families are being displaced, properties are being seized under bogus violations, and there's a pattern. It all leads back to one judge and a network of developers. I have proof, but I need someone I can trust. Larry had promised to meet with him that weekend. He never got the chance. Standing at Harold's funeral, watching Harold's daughter weep over a casket that held a man who died seeking justice, Larry made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't fight the system from a penthouse office. He needed to see it from the bottom. He needed to become invisible. Within a week, Larry had liquidated his assets, placed everything in a blind trust managed by his younger sister, and walked away from his life. He didn't just research homelessness, he lived it. He spent 6 months in the tent encampments along Henderson Street, the very properties at the center of Harold's investigation. He slept on cardboard, ate at soup kitchens, and watched as Judge Westbruce's enforcement officers harassed his new friends, citing violations that didn't exist, threatening arrests for crimes that weren't crimes. He learned their names. Teresa, who had 3 kids and a notice of eviction for unauthorized occupants. Her own children. Marcus, a disabled veteran who was cited for loitering while sitting on the bench outside his own apartment building. Yolanda, an elderly woman whose home of 30 years was condemned for structural issues that materialized only after a developer made an offer the city couldn't refuse. Every name, every story, every injustice. Larry documented it all, and then he planned his arrest. He knew Judge Bruce's schedule, knew which days he took cases, knew his rotation. Larry stood on the private property of Henderson Tower, owned by the same Marcus Finch who was buying up the seized properties, and waited for security to call the police. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply ensured he would end up in Courtroom 4B on a Friday morning, standing before the one man who had orchestrated it all. The public defender assigned to his case was a tired young woman named Jennifer Kim, who looked at Larry's file and sighed. Mr. Bowens, I know you want your day in court, but with your record 3 vagrancy citations, no address, no employment, you're looking at 90 days minimum if you fight this. If you plead guilty now, I can probably get you time served and probation. Larry looked at her with kind eyes. Miss Kim, I appreciate your concern, but I'm going to represent myself. Jennifer's expression shifted from tired to alarmed. That's really not a good idea. Trust me, Larry said softly. I've been told that before. As the courtroom filled that Friday morning, packed with spectators who'd come to watch Judge Bruce's infamous Friday flush, where he cleared his docket by humiliating the city's most vulnerable, Larry sat quietly in his tattered coat. He ignored the whispers, the pointed fingers, the mothers pulling their children away from the homeless man. He was waiting for Judge Westbruce to walk in, to sit on his elevated throne, to look down at Larry with that familiar contempt. Waiting for the judge to seal his own fate with his own words. Because Larry knew something that no one else in that courtroom understood. The real trial wasn't about vagrancy or public nuisance. It was about justice. And justice, as Larry had learned in 6 months on the streets, had a way of coming from the most unexpected places. When Judge Bruce's gavel fell, and those cruel words left his mouth about the only bar you're qualified for, Larry felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. The trap had been set for months. Now it was time to spring it. 10 months earlier, Lawrence Bowens sat in the corner office on the 42nd floor of Whitmore and Associates, staring at a check for $275,000. It was his quarterly bonus. He'd earned it by convincing a jury that a pharmaceutical company's negligence wasn't really negligence, just an unfortunate series of coincidences that happened to kill 11 people. The company's stock had surged 15% the day after the verdict. His senior partner had sent champagne. Larry had poured it down the sink. He'd been doing this for 18 years. Whitmore and Associates was the kind of firm that other firms whispered about with equal parts envy and fear. When a Fortune 500 company needed someone to make a lawsuit disappear, they called Whitmore. When a politician needed a scandal buried so deep it would never see daylight, they called Whitmore. And when Whitmore needed the impossible, they called Larry Bowens. The fixer. That's what they called him in the legal journals. The man who could find the angle, exploit the loophole, charm the jury, and dismantle the opposition's case so thoroughly that opposing counsel would sometimes simply give up mid-trial. He'd won cases that had no business being won. He'd saved careers that deserved to end. He'd made millions for people who already had billions. And every night, he went home to an empty penthouse and asked himself the same question. What am I doing? His assistant, Patricia, had once asked him why he never smiled after victories anymore. Larry had looked at her, this bright young woman who still believed in the majesty of the law, and he'd almost told her the truth, that he felt like a mercenary, that justice had become a commodity he sold to the highest bidder, that the scales of justice weren't balanced, they were rigged, and he was the one holding the weights. Instead, he'd said he was tired and asked her to hold his calls. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon. Larry had been preparing for a deposition when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in years. Harold Chun. Judge Harold Chun had been Larry's mentor when he was a young public defender fresh out of law school. Harold was the one who'd taught him that the law wasn't about winning, it was about doing what was right. Harold was also the one who'd encouraged Larry to take the job at Whitmore, to make some money, to build his reputation. You can't help people if you're drowning in student debt, Harold had said. Get established. Then come back and do the real work. That was 18 years ago. Larry had never come back. Larry, I need your help. Harold's voice was shaking, and that alone sent ice through Larry's veins. Harold Chun didn't shake. Harold Chun had stared down mob lawyers, corrupt politicians, and death threats without flinching. What's wrong? Not over the phone. Can you meet me? Tonight? I have something you need to see. They'd agreed to meet that Saturday at Harold's home. But Saturday never came. On Thursday morning, Larry received a call from Harold's daughter, Sarah. She could barely speak through her tears. He's dead, Larry. They're saying it was his heart, but he was healthy. He was fine. And there were papers all over his study, like he'd been working on something important. The police took everything. Larry had gone to the funeral in a daze. The church was packed with judges, attorneys, community organizers, people whose lives Harold had touched. During the eulogy, Sarah stood at the podium and said something that cut through Larry like a blade. My father spent his last days fighting for people who had no voice. He was investigating something he believed would change lives, something that made him afraid for the first time in his career. He died before he could finish that work. But I know my father. He wouldn't want us to mourn. He'd want us to finish what he started. Larry had approached Sarah after the service. What was he working on? She'd handed him a small USB drive, her hands trembling. He mailed this to me the day before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone I trusted. Someone who would know what to do with it. That night, Larry had sat in his home office and opened the files. What he found made his blood run cold. Spreadsheets tracking property seizures in low-income neighborhoods. Audio recordings of conversations between developers and city officials. Emails discussing clearing out undesirables. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web, was Judge West Bruce. Harold's final notes were dated the night before his death. The pattern is clear. Bruce is approving bogus code violations, rushing evictions, and these properties are being sold within weeks to Finch Development for pennies on the dollar. Families are being destroyed. This is systemic, calculated, and criminal. But I can't prove the coordination yet. I need more time. Larry had stared at those words until the sun came up. Harold had died seeking justice for people who would never make it through Whitmore's doors. People who couldn't afford a $1,000 an hour attorney. People the system was designed to crush. The next morning, Larry had called his sister, Regina, the only person in his life he truly trusted. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm ready to answer them. 2 weeks later, Lawrence Bowens, Esquire, ceased to exist on paper. His assets were liquidated and hidden in a blind trust. His apartment was leased to a shell corporation. His phone was disconnected. He told his partners he was taking a sabbatical to deal with Harold's death. They'd been understanding in that performative way that people are when they don't actually care. Then Larry had walked out of his office with nothing but a backpack and Harold's USB drive. He'd gone to a thrift store and bought the kind of clothes that people don't look at twice. He'd stopped shaving. He'd let his hair grow wild. And then he'd walked to Henderson Street, to the tent city where some of Harold's victims were living, and he'd introduced himself simply as Larry. No one there cared that he'd once argued before the Supreme Court. No one asked about his credentials or his pedigree. They shared their food, their stories, and their pain. And for the first time in 18 years, Larry felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had been a giant in the legal world. Now he was a ghost in the streets. And he was about to become Judge West Bruce's worst nightmare. The first night on the concrete, Larry didn't sleep. The cardboard beneath him did nothing to soften the sidewalk, and every sound, the distant sirens, the shuffle of footsteps, the clatter of shopping carts, kept him alert and anxious. He'd read about homelessness, studied the statistics, even donated to shelters over the years. But reading about cold is different from feeling it seep into your bones. Reading about hunger is different from watching the soup kitchen close its doors because you arrived 10 minutes too late. By dawn, he understood something fundamental. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was designed to be invisible to people who never had to look down. The Henderson Street encampment stretched along 3 blocks of chain-link fence behind an abandoned warehouse. About 40 people called it home, though that number fluctuated daily as some found temporary shelter, and others arrived with nowhere else to go. Larry set up his tent in a corner spot and kept his head down those first few days, observing and listening. That's how he met Marcus Webb. Marcus was a 53-year-old veteran who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and came home to find that the country he'd fought for didn't have room for him anymore. He'd lost his apartment 3 months earlier when the building was condemned for structural defects. Defects that Marcus swore didn't exist until the city inspector showed up with a clipboard and a predetermined conclusion. "They wanted us out," Marcus told Larry one evening as they shared a can of beans heated over a camping stove. "Building was solid. I lived there 8 years. But then some developer came sniffing around, made an offer to the landlord, and suddenly we got violation notices. Faulty wiring, they said. Unsafe plumbing. I'm an electrician, Larry. I know wiring. There was nothing wrong with that building except that it was sitting on property someone else wanted." Larry listened and took mental notes. Later, when Marcus was asleep, Larry documented everything in a small notebook he kept hidden in his coat lining. Property address, date of condemnation, the name of the inspector, the name of the developer, Finch Development Corporation, the same name that appeared on Harold's files. Teresa Morales arrived at the encampment 2 weeks after Larry. She came with 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 10, and a garbage bag containing everything they owned. She'd been evicted for unauthorized occupants. Even though the unauthorized occupants were her own children, the landlord claimed her lease specified a maximum of 2 residents. Teresa had shown Larry the lease on her phone before her service was cut off. Said no such thing. "I paid every month on time," she told Larry, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Every single month for 4 years. But he wanted to renovate, turn the units into luxury apartments. Easier to do that if you get rid of the families who actually need affordable housing." Larry helped Teresa set up her tent and watched her children try to sleep on the hard ground. The 8-year-old, Sophia, kept crying softly. She was embarrassed to go to school anymore because the other kids made fun of her clothes, and she was afraid her teacher would find out she was homeless. Larry felt something crack inside his chest watching that little girl try to be invisible. Another name in his notebook. Another family destroyed by the machine. Then came the enforcers. They arrived on Tuesday mornings like clockwork, police officers, code enforcement, sometimes private security hired by the city. They didn't come to help. They came to harass, to intimidate, to make life on the streets so unbearable that people would simply disappear. Larry watched them cite Marcus for illegal camping, even though he was on public property. He watched them confiscate Teresa's camping stove for being a fire hazard, while her children went hungry. He watched them tear down tents, throw away belongings, and hand out citations that came with court dates no one could afford to attend. And he watched the pattern. Every person who received a citation had one thing in common. They'd been displaced from properties that Finch Development had acquired. Every single one. The enforcers weren't random sweeps. They were targeted operations designed to silence the witnesses to Judge Bruce's scheme. One morning, Larry watched as Officer Derek Kane approached an elderly woman named Yolanda Price. Yolanda was 72 years old and had lived in her Henderson Street apartment for 30 years before it was condemned. She suffered from arthritis and diabetes, and sleeping on the streets was slowly killing her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your ID," Kane said, his hand resting casually on his belt. "I already showed you yesterday," Yolanda replied wearily. "Well, I need to see it again, and I'm going to need you to move along. This is private property." "We're on the sidewalk, officer. Public sidewalk." Kane's expression hardened. "Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Larry stood up from his spot 30 feet away. He knew this game. Kane would escalate until Yolanda either left or got arrested. Either way, another citation, another court date, another appearance before Judge West Bruce, who would fine her money she didn't have and threaten her with jail time she couldn't survive. "Officer," Larry called out, his voice rough from weeks of disuse. "She's not on private property. Municipal Code 14-237 clearly defines the sidewalk as public right-of-way. You need probable cause to demand identification." Kane turned to look at Larry with barely concealed contempt. "And who the hell are you?" "Nobody," Larry said quietly. "Just somebody who knows the law." Kane stared at him for a long moment, then scoffed. "Stay out of police business, vagrant, or you'll be the one getting a citation." But he left Yolanda alone that day, and Larry added another name to his list. Officer Derek Kane. Badge number 2847. Present at 17 separate harassment incidents. Always working Tuesday mornings. Always targeting former residents of Finch Development properties. 6 months Larry spent in that encampment. 6 months watching families suffer while the city looked away. 6 months documenting every name, every violation, every enforcer who came through like clockwork. He learned that Marcus had a daughter who wouldn't speak to him because she was ashamed. He learned that Teresa sang to her children every night to help them sleep. He learned that Yolanda kept a photograph of her late husband in her coat pocket and looked at it whenever things got too hard. These weren't statistics. They were people. Harold had died trying to save them, and Larry was going to finish what his mentor started. But first, he needed to get arrested. He needed to stand in front of Judge West Bruce. He needed to look the man in the eye and watch him condemn himself with his own words. And he knew exactly how to make that happen. Larry spent 3 days studying Judge West Bruce's schedule. It wasn't difficult information to obtain, court dockets were public record, and Bruce's rotation was predictable. Fridays were his favorite. That's when he held what the courthouse staff privately called the Friday Flush. A morning session dedicated to clearing out minor offenses, mostly involving the city's homeless population. Bruce treated it like sport, dispatching cases in under 2 minutes each, handing out fines and sentences with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never missed a meal or worried about where he'd sleep. Perfect. Larry also knew that arrests made on Henderson Street properties typically ended up in Bruce's courtroom. The judge had specifically requested jurisdiction over cases involving that neighborhood, a detail that seemed unremarkable until you understood why. Bruce wanted control over anyone who might complain about the property seizures. He wanted to silence them personally. Now Larry was going to give him that chance. Henderson Tower stood at the corner of Henderson and 5th, a gleaming monument to gentrification surrounded by a neighborhood it had helped destroy. The property belonged to Finch Development Corporation, though the building itself was still under construction. A 15-story luxury apartment complex that would rent for 3 times what the displaced families had been paying. A chain-link fence surrounded the construction site, decorated with no trespassing signs and warnings about prosecution. Larry stood across the street on Thursday afternoon, watching security guards patrol the perimeter. He timed their rounds, every 20 minutes like clockwork. The gap in coverage was small, but Larry didn't need much time. He just needed to be visible enough to get caught but not suspicious enough to raise alarms about his intent. Marcus had asked him that morning where he was going. Larry had simply said he had business to take care of. Marcus had studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful, brother." Larry wondered if Marcus suspected something. The old veteran had sharp eyes, the kind that saw through pretense. At 3:15, Larry crossed the street. He wore his usual tattered jacket and carried nothing but his notebook hidden in the lining and the recording device sewn into the collar. He'd activated it an hour earlier. From this point forward, everything would be documented. He walked directly to the fence, found the section where the lock had been recently replaced, a weak point, and slipped through. The construction site was empty on a Thursday afternoon, most of the workers having left early. Larry walked deliberately toward the center of the property, toward the foundation of what would become the building's lobby. He could see security cameras tracking his movement. Good. He wanted them to see him. Then he sat down on a stack of lumber and waited. Took 12 minutes. The security guard who found him was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested this was his first real job. His hand went immediately to his radio. "Control, I've got a trespasser. Homeless guy, looks unarmed. Requesting backup and police." Larry remained seated, hands visible, non-threatening. This was critical. He needed to be arrested, not beaten, not shot. The optics had to be perfect. "Sir, you need to leave this property immediately," the guard said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm aware this is private property," Larry replied calmly. "I'm choosing to remain here." The guard blinked, confused. Most people ran or argued or made excuses. "Sir, if you don't leave, you'll be arrested." "I understand." 2 more guards arrived, followed 5 minutes later by 2 police officers. Larry recognized one of them. Officer Melissa Santos, who'd been part of the Tuesday sweeps but had always seemed uncomfortable with the harassment. She looked at Larry with something close to pity. "Sir, I need you to stand up and put your hands behind your back," she said. Larry complied. The metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, cold and tight. He'd been arrested before, decades ago during a protest in law school, but the sensation was different now. Then he'd been indignant, full of righteous anger. Now he felt only a cold satisfaction. Every part of this was going according to plan. "You have the right to remain silent," Santos began. "I waive that right," Larry interrupted. "I'd like to make a statement. I deliberately entered this property knowing it was private and restricted. I did so of my own free will, and I refuse to leave. I understand I'm being charged with criminal trespass." Santos exchanged a glance with her partner. "Sir, you don't have to say anything. I want it on record," Larry said firmly. "I'm guilty of trespassing on property owned by Finch Development Corporation. I want my day in court." The booking process took 3 hours. They photographed him, fingerprinted him, logged his personal effects, which amounted to nothing of value. Larry gave his name as Lawrence Bowens, provided no address, no phone number, no emergency contact. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a homeless man who'd made a stupid decision. They put him in a holding cell with 6 other men, most of whom were sleeping off various substances. Larry sat on the concrete bench and closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He was calculating. The arrest was Thursday evening. Processing would take until Friday morning. His arraignment would be scheduled for Friday afternoon, Judge West Bruce's Friday flush. 12 hours until he faced the man who'd killed his mentor and destroyed dozens of families. 12 hours until Lawrence Bowens, the ghost, became Lawrence Bowens, the reckoning. A guard walked past the cell around midnight, shaking his head at the row of men society had discarded. He didn't look at Larry twice. No one did. That was the power of invisibility. People saw what they expected to see. A homeless man, a vagrant, a nobody. They never saw the trap closing until it was too late. Larry leaned his head back against the cold concrete wall and allowed himself the smallest smile. Judge West Bruce thought Friday would be just another day of wielding his power over the powerless. He thought he'd humiliate another broken man and be on the golf course by noon. He had no idea he was about to face the ghost of every crime he'd ever committed. And the ghost had brought receipts. Friday morning arrived with the mechanical efficiency of a system that had processed thousands of forgotten people. Larry was transported from the holding cell to the courthouse in a van with 11 other defendants, all of them wearing the same exhausted resignation. They shuffled through security, were herded into a waiting area, and told to sit quietly until their names were called. Courtroom 4B smelled like old wood, cheap cologne, and desperation. The gallery was half full with the usual mix of board attorneys, court-ordered observers, and a handful of people who'd come to watch Judge Bruce's infamous Friday morning show. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. This was where justice came to die quietly. Larry sat in the back row designated for defendants, his hands folded calmly in his lap. 2 seats away, a young man was crying softly. 3 rows ahead, an elderly woman clutched a rosary. Everyone in this room knew how the script went. Judge Bruce would call your name, you'd stand, your public defender would advise you to plead guilty, and Bruce would hand down whatever punishment amused him that morning. The whole process took 90 seconds per person, maybe 2 minutes if someone was foolish enough to argue. Jennifer Kim found Larry 20 minutes before the session began. She looked even more exhausted than she had at the jail, her coffee cup trembling slightly in her hand. She sat down next to him and opened a folder containing his file. "Mr. Bowens," she said quietly, "I've reviewed your case. Criminal trespass, first offense for this charge specifically, but you have 3 prior vagrancy citations. Judge Bruce doesn't like repeat offenders." "I understand," Larry said. "I can get you a deal. Plead guilty, time served, 6 months supervised probation. You'll have to stay away from Henderson Street properties, but you'll walk out of here today. If you fight this, you're looking at 90 days minimum, possibly 6 months in county." Larry looked at her. She was young, maybe 28, with the kind of idealism that public defenders started with and lost quickly. He could see she genuinely wanted to help him. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Kim, but I'm going to represent myself." Her expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Mr. Bowens, that's really not advisable. Judge Bruce doesn't have patience for pro-SE defendants, especially in these Friday sessions. He'll tear you apart. I'm aware. You could end up with the maximum sentence. He might even add contempt charges if he thinks you're wasting the court's time. I understand the risks." Jennifer stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for some explanation that made sense. Finally, she closed the folder. "It's your right to represent yourself. I'll inform the court." She paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're making a mistake." "I've been told that before," Larry said softly. At 9 o'clock sharp, Judge West Bruce entered through the door behind the bench. Everyone stood. Bruce was exactly as Larry remembered from 6 months of research. 62 years old, silver hair styled with expensive product, a Rolex that caught the light as he adjusted his robe. His face carried the smugness of a man who'd spent decades wielding unchecked power over people who couldn't fight back. "Be seated," Bruce said, his voice carrying the bored authority of someone who'd said those words 10,000 times. He settled into his chair with the satisfied air of a king taking his throne. Let's make this quick, people. I have a tea time at noon. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Nervous, performative laughter from people who knew better than to stay silent when Judge Bruce made a joke. The first 5 cases went exactly as Larry had predicted. Names were called. Public defenders whispered urgently to their clients. Everyone pled guilty. Bruce handed down sentences with mechanical efficiency, occasionally adding a cutting remark that drew more nervous laughter from the gallery. A woman who'd been caught shoplifting baby formula was told she should have kept her legs closed if she couldn't afford kids. A man cited for sleeping in his car was told to get a job like everyone else. Each comment was a small cruelty, and Bruce savored them. Then the bailiff called Larry's name. Lawrence Bowens. Case number 24, CR 8847. Criminal trespass. Larry stood and walked to the defendant's table. He could feel every eye in the courtroom on him, or rather on what they thought they saw. A homeless man in a stained jacket, matted hair, the faint smell of the streets. Just another vagrant cycling through the system. Judge Bruce barely glanced at the file before looking up. His expression was one of practiced contempt. Mr. Bowens, I see here you've decided to decline representation from the public defender's office. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself. A smile played at the corner of Bruce's mouth. This was entertainment. Mr. Bowens, do you have any legal training whatsoever? I do, Your Honor. Oh, Bruce leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. And where exactly did you attend law school? The University of the Underpass? Did you graduate magna cum dumpster? The courtroom erupted in laughter. Even the bailiff smirked. Bruce waited for the noise to die down, then continued. Let me save us all some time. You trespassed on private property. You were caught red-handed. You even confessed to the arresting officers. The smart play here is to plead guilty, take your 90 days, and learn a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property. Because the alternative, wasting this court's time with a trial you cannot possibly win, will result in me throwing every charge I can find at you. Larry remained perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the table. I understand, Your Honor, but I'm pleading not guilty, and I'd like to proceed to trial. Judge Bruce's smile widened. He was going to enjoy this. Not guilty, of course, because why wouldn't a man caught on camera, at the scene with multiple witnesses, want to drag this out? He shook his head in mock disappointment. Mr. Bowens, the only bar you're qualified for is the one at the bottom of a bottle. More laughter, louder this time. Someone in the gallery actually applauded, and Larry smiled. It was a small smile, cold and knowing, and it lasted only a second. But Judge West Bruce saw it. For just a moment, confusion flickered across his face. Why would this broken man smile at being humiliated? But then Bruce shook it off. He'd seen every kind of crazy in this courtroom. This was just another delusional vagrant who thought he was smarter than the system. Your Honor, Larry said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife through silk. With all due respect, you've just violated my Fourth Amendment rights by denying me a fair hearing based on my appearance. The laughter died. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Bruce's smile faded. Excuse me? Larry straightened, and something in his posture changed. The weariness vanished. The defeated slouch disappeared. He stood like a man who'd spent decades commanding courtrooms far more prestigious than this one. You've demonstrated clear bias and prejudice, Your Honor, and I believe we're just getting started. The trap had finally sprung. Judge Bruce's face flushed crimson. His fingers drummed against the bench, a nervous tic he probably didn't realize he had. Mr. Bowens, I'm warning you. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness, Larry interrupted, his voice steady and precise. Officer Melissa Santos, the arresting officer. She's present in the courtroom. Bruce's jaw tightened. This wasn't how Friday Flush was supposed to go. These cases were supposed to be over in 90 seconds. This is a preliminary hearing, not a trial. Under the Sixth Amendment, I have the right to confront witnesses against me, even at preliminary proceedings when my liberty is at stake. Would you like me to cite the relevant case law, Your Honor, or shall we proceed? The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Jennifer Kim, still seated at the public defender's table, looked like she just watched a homeless man turn into a completely different person. Officer Santos stood slowly from her seat in the gallery, her expression uncertain. Bruce waved his hand dismissively, trying to regain control. Fine, let's get this over with. Bailiff, swear in the officer. Santos approached the witness stand and took the oath, her eyes flickering nervously between Larry and the judge. Larry could see it in her face. She knew something was wrong about the Tuesday sweeps, had probably always known, but had convinced herself she was just following orders. Officer Santos, Larry began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd cross-examined hundreds of witnesses. You arrested me on Thursday, November 16th, at approximately 3:27 p.m. Is that correct? Yes. And what was I doing when you arrived? You were sitting on a stack of lumber on the Henderson Tower construction site. Was I armed? No. Threatening anyone? No. Destroying property? No. In fact, Officer Santos, I was simply sitting there, wasn't I? Waiting to be arrested. Santos shifted uncomfortably. You were trespassing on private property. Indeed, and I made no attempt to hide, flee, or resist arrest. I actually confessed to the crime immediately and stated I wanted my day in court. Larry moved closer to the witness stand, his tattered coat suddenly looking less like rags and more like costume. Tell me, officer, how many trespassing arrests have you made on Henderson Street properties in the last 6 months? Santos hesitated. I don't have exact numbers. Approximately. Maybe 20? 25. And of those arrests, how many involved people who were actually homeless? I'm not sure. Let me help you. All of them. Every single one. Larry's voice was calm, surgical. And officer, how many of those people had previously lived in buildings that were condemned and seized in the Henderson Street neighborhood? The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection. This is completely irrelevant to the trespass charge. Your Honor, Larry said, turning to face Judge Bruce directly. It's absolutely relevant. It establishes a pattern of selective enforcement targeting specific individuals. It goes directly to the question of whether my arrest was legitimate or part of a coordinated harassment campaign. Bruce's knuckles were white against the bench. Overruled. Answer the question, officer. Santos looked trapped. I don't know their housing history. I just respond to calls. But you do respond to the same area. Every Tuesday morning. Always Henderson Street. Always targeting people who appear homeless. Isn't that correct? Those are my assigned patrols. Assigned by whom? My sergeant. And who determines which areas are priorities for homeless enforcement? Santos's voice dropped to almost a whisper. It comes from the City Coordination Office. The same office that processes requests from judges regarding community concerns? Larry let the question hang in the air. He pulled out his small notebook, the one he'd kept hidden for 6 months, and opened it. Officer Santos, do you know a man named Marcus Webb? Elderly veteran, cited for loitering outside his own former apartment building. I don't recall. Teresa Morales? 3 children, cited for illegal camping. Santos's face had gone pale. Yolanda Price? 72 years old. Diabetic, cited 17 times in 4 months. Larry's voice grew harder with each name. All of them former residents of properties seized in Henderson Street. All of them targeted. All of them appearing before this court. He turned to face Judge Bruce fully. All of them appearing before you, Your Honor. The judge's face had transformed from red to ashen. "Mr. Bowens, what exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm stating facts." Larry reached into the torn lining of his coat with deliberate slowness. "And I have 6 months of documentation to prove it. Every name, every citation, every pattern of harassment designed to silence the victims of an illegal property seizure scheme." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Bruce slammed his gavel, but his hand was shaking. "Order! I will have order!" Larry held up his notebook for the entire courtroom to see. "The question isn't whether I trespassed, Your Honor. The question is why you wanted me arrested in the first place. Why you want all of us silenced." And then Larry smiled, cold, knowing, and absolutely terrifying. "Shall we continue, Your Honor? Or would you like to reconsider how this morning proceeds?" Judge Bruce's gavel came down 3 times, sharp cracks that echoed through the stunned courtroom. "Mr. Bowens, you are dangerously close to contempt. Contempt." Larry's voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. The way he said the word, with perfect diction, the cadence of someone who'd spent decades commanding rooms far more important than this one, made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. "An interesting choice of words, Your Honor. From the Latin contemptus, meaning scorn or disdain. But we both know that what you're really afraid of isn't my contempt for this court. It's the truth." The prosecutor was on his feet again, but he looked uncertain now, like a man who'd just realized he was standing on ice that was starting to crack. "Your Honor, I move to have this defendant removed." "On what grounds?" Larry turned to face him, and the transformation was complete. The shuffle was gone from his walk. The defeated slouch had vanished from his shoulders. He moved with the controlled precision of a predator who'd been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. "I'm exercising my constitutional rights. I'm cross-examining a witness. I'm presenting a defense. Unless you'd like to add, exercising legal rights while homeless to the charges." Judge Bruce's voice was strained. "Mr. Bowens, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here. Don't you?" Larry's eyes locked onto the judge's, and there was nothing broken in that gaze. Nothing defeated. "You don't recognize the way I'm dismantling this case? The way I'm building a narrative that connects property seizures to selective enforcement to judicial corruption? You've never seen this strategy before?" Something flickered across Bruce's face. Recognition, maybe, or the first stirring of real fear. "Let me help you, Your Honor." Larry's voice dropped lower, more intimate, as if he were sharing a secret with the entire courtroom. 12 years ago, there was a case. Harrington versus Metropolitan Development. A housing fraud scheme involving a judge in Philadelphia who was approving illegal seizures in exchange for kickbacks from developers. The case was considered unwinnable. The judge had covered his tracks perfectly, paid off the right people, buried the evidence. But someone found a pattern. Someone spent 8 months building a prosecutable case from nothing but correlation and circumstantial evidence. Someone got that judge 30 years in federal prison. Bruce's hand had stopped drumming. His face was draining of color. "That someone," Larry continued, his voice steady and relentless, "was a corporate attorney named Lawrence Bowens. They called him the Fixer in legal circles. But the criminals he hunted had another name for him. They called him the Ghost. Because by the time you realized he was investigating you, your life was already over." The courtroom had gone deathly silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Larry reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a leather credential case. The leather was pristine, expensive, completely at odds with the tattered jacket surrounding it. He walked forward and handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench with trembling hands. Judge Bruce opened it. His eyes scanned the contents, the bar certifications, the credentials, the identification that proved exactly who was standing in his courtroom. The credential case slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the bench. His face had gone from pale to ghostly white. My full name, Larry said, his voice filling every corner of the courtroom, is Lawrence Elijah Bowens, Esquire, former senior partner at Whitmore and Associates, where I specialized in unraveling complex fraud schemes. Member of the bar in 12 states. I've argued before the Supreme Court. I've dismantled criminal enterprises worth billions of dollars. And for the past 6 months, Your Honor, I've been living on Henderson Street, documenting every single crime you've committed. A woman in the gallery gasped. The prosecutor had gone pale. Jennifer Kim was staring at Larry like she just watched a magic trick she couldn't explain. But Larry's eyes never left Judge Bruce. You wanted to know where I went to law school, Your Honor? Ill. Class of 2006. Graduated second in my class. The person who graduated first? Judge Harold Chin. The man who taught me that the law isn't about winning, it's about justice. The man who died investigating you. Bruce's mouth opened, but no sound came out. You've been wondering why a homeless man would insist on his day in court. Why someone with nothing would risk contempt charges and jail time just to challenge a simple trespass charge. Larry leaned forward slightly, and his voice became cold. Final. It's because I'm not the one on trial here, Your Honor. You are. Every word spoken in this courtroom this morning has been recorded. Every pattern I've documented is admissible. Every victim I've cataloged is ready to testify. Larry straightened, and for the first time in 6 months, he looked like exactly what he was, one of the most dangerous attorneys in the country. The ghost you never saw coming, he said softly, has been standing in front of you the entire time. Judge West Bruce gripped the edges of his bench, and his hands were shaking. Judge Bruce tried to speak, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. This is some kind of setup. You can't just what, Your Honor? Larry's hand moved to the collar of his tattered coat. Can't just gather evidence of judicial corruption? Can't just document crimes being committed in plain sight? Or can't just record conversations that occur in public spaces where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy? His fingers found the small device sewn into the fabric, and he pulled it free with a gentle tug. It was no larger than a pen, sleek and black, with a small LED that blinked green. Larry held it up for the entire courtroom to see. This, he said, his voice carrying perfect courtroom acoustics, is a Class A digital recording device, military grade. It's been transmitting to a secure server for the past 6 months. Every conversation, every interaction, every piece of evidence I needed to build a federal racketeering case. The prosecutor looked like he might be sick. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of. Of course you didn't, Larry said almost kindly. You're not part of this. You're just doing your job. But Judge Bruce knows exactly what I'm talking about. Don't you, Your Honor? Bruce's face had gone from white to a sickly gray. His hands gripped the bench so hard his knuckles looked like they might split the skin. You can't record in a courthouse without consent. Actually, I can record in any public space in this state, as per the single-party consent law. And this particular device has been recording since 7:45 this morning, when I was brought into this building. Larry's smile was razor-thin, which means it captured a very interesting conversation that took place in the hallway outside this courtroom at approximately 8:20 a.m. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. You had a visitor this morning, didn't you, Judge Bruce? A man in an expensive suit who pulled you aside for a private word. A man I've been documenting for 6 months. Marcus Finch, CEO of Finch Development Corporation. Bruce's eyes went wide with something beyond fear. It was the look of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Larry touched the device, and a small speaker crackled to life. His voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. The quality is excellent. Let me play you a sample. The recording began. First, there was the ambient sound of a courthouse hallway. Footsteps, distant conversations, the echo of doors opening and closing. then two voices close to the microphone. Larry must have been standing nearby, invisible in his homeless disguise. The first voice was smooth, confident, belonging to a man used to getting what he wanted. The Henderson properties are almost clear, just a few stragglers left. That veteran, the old woman, and a couple others who keep coming back. Judge Bruce's voice came next, irritated and unmistakable. I'm handling it, Marcus. Every one of them gets cited, every one of them comes through my courtroom. I fine them until they can't afford to stay in the city. The ones who can't pay go to jail. Either way, they're gone. And the timeline? 2 months. Maybe 3. We need to be careful. There are activists starting to ask questions. Then stop being careful and start being decisive. We have investors waiting. The luxury development won't work if we have tent cities visible from the balconies. A pause. Then, the usual amount? Double it. This is getting complicated. And I want assurances that if anything goes sideways, you'll be protected. You always are. Just keep the courtroom pipeline moving. Larry stopped the playback. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Someone in the gallery was crying softly. The bailiff had taken 2 steps back from the bench, as if proximity to Judge Bruce might be contagious. Would you like to hear more, Your Honor? Larry's voice was perfectly calm. The voice of a surgeon who just made the killing incision. I have 6 months of recordings. 18 separate conversations between you and Finch. 14 conversations between you and city officials discussing priority enforcement areas. 7 conversations where you explicitly coordinate with police to target specific individuals. Judge Bruce's mouth moved, but no words came out. His career, his reputation, his freedom. Larry could see it all crumbling behind his eyes. The device has been uploading to cloud storage in real time, Larry continued. Encrypted, backed up across multiple servers with copies sent to several interested parties. Even if you confiscate this one, the evidence already exists in 47 different locations. The prosecutor found his voice, shaky and uncertain. Your Honor, I need to recuse myself from this case. I need to contact the State Attorney General immediately. Nobody's leaving this courtroom. Larry's voice cracked like a whip. Not until we finish what we started. You wanted to sentence me, Judge Bruce? You wanted to humiliate me? Fine. Let's continue. Let's put everything on the record. Every crime, every victim, every dollar you made destroying families. Larry held up the recording device one more time, and the green light blinked steadily, like a heartbeat. Because this ghost, he said quietly, brought receipts. The heavy oak doors at the back of Courtroom 4B swung open with a force that made everyone turn. 4 men in dark suits entered, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They wore badges clipped to their belts, and the lead agent, a tall black man with gray at his temples, scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd done this 100 times before. United States Marshal Service, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Nobody leaves this courtroom. 2 marshals moved immediately to block the doors. The distinctive sound of locks engaging echoed through the chamber. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. But the lead marshal shook his head once, a clear warning. The bailiff's hand dropped. Judge Bruce half stood from his bench, trying to summon whatever authority he had left. What is the meaning of this? This is my courtroom. Not anymore, it isn't. The lead marshal walked down the center aisle with measured steps, and Larry noticed the small earpiece in his left ear, the subtle bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. Your Honor, my name is Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Garrett. I'm here to execute a federal warrant. Bruce's face went from gray to crimson. A warrant? For whom? This is highly irregular. For you, Judge West Bruce. Marshal Garrett reached the front of the courtroom and pulled a folded document from his inside pocket. For conspiracy to commit wire fraud, racketeering under RICO statutes, bribery of a public official, and deprivation of rights under color of law. I'm also authorized to inform you that the FBI has simultaneously executed search warrants for your chambers, your home, and your financial records. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. The prosecutor sat down heavily, his face in his hands. Jennifer Kim looked like she was watching reality itself fracture. Judge Bruce gripped the bench, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and terror. You can't arrest a sitting judge in his own courtroom. I have immunity. Judicial immunity doesn't extend to criminal acts, Your Honor. I think you know that. Marshal Garrett's voice was flat, professional. Step down from the bench, please. I will not. Bruce's voice cracked. This is a setup. This man, he pointed at Larry with a shaking finger. He entrapped me. Those recordings are inadmissible. Actually, Larry said quietly, they're not. Single-party consent recording in a public space. And even if they were inadmissible in a criminal trial, they were more than sufficient to establish probable cause for federal investigators to obtain proper warrants. Which they did. 3 months ago. Bruce's face went slack. 3 months. That's right, Your Honor. Marshal Garrett gestured, and 2 more agents entered through a side door, these ones in FBI windbreakers. Mr. Bowens contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit 6 months ago with preliminary evidence. We've been building this case ever since. The recordings were just the beginning. We have financial records, wire transfers, testimony from Finch Development employees who were given immunity, and a pattern of behavior spanning 7 years. Larry watched as understanding dawned on Bruce's face. You didn't just come here to clear your name, the judge whispered. This whole arrest, the trespassing charge, it was all to get me on record. To make me incriminate myself. To give you enough rope to hang yourself, Larry corrected. Every word you said this morning, every insult, every display of bias, every moment you demonstrated you were willing to abuse your power. It's all on record now. Not just my recording. The court's official audio. The court reporter's transcript. All of it admissible, all of it damning. Marshal Garrett pulled out handcuffs. Judge Bruce, you need to step down from the bench. Now. Bruce looked around the courtroom desperately, searching for allies, for escape, for any way out. He found none. The bailiff had moved away. The prosecutor wouldn't meet his eyes. The gallery stared at him with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Some of these people had watched him humiliate defendants for years, and now they were watching karma arrive with a federal warrant. I want my attorney, Bruce said, his voice small. You'll have the opportunity to contact counsel after you're processed. Marshal Garrett's tone didn't change. Step down, Your Honor. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Judge West Bruce descended from his bench slowly, each step seeming to age him 5 years. His expensive robe hung on him like a shroud. When he reached the floor level, Marshal Garrett moved behind him with practiced efficiency. Judge West Bruce, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. The words Larry had heard Bruce speak dismissively to hundreds of defendants now applied to him. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. The same cuffs that had held Marcus, Teresa, Yolanda, and countless others whose only crime was being poor and in the way of profit. As marshals led Bruce toward the side exit, he passed within feet of Larry. Their eyes met for one brief moment. Bruce's held defeat, betrayal, and the dawning realization of everything he'd lost. Larry's held nothing but cold justice. The court, Larry said quietly to the empty bench, is adjourned. 3 weeks later, Lawrence Bowens stood on the courthouse steps in a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was cut, his face clean-shaven, and the morning sun glinted off cufflinks that had spent 6 months wrapped in newspaper at the bottom of a storage unit. Behind him, the same courthouse where Judge Bruce had dispensed cruelty now stood as a monument to his downfall. The media had gathered in force. Cameras, reporters, satellite trucks lined up along the street. But Larry wasn't looking at them. His eyes were on the crowd assembled on the steps below him. Marcus Webb stood in the front row, wearing a pressed shirt someone had donated. Teresa Morales held her daughter Sophia's hand, the little girl no longer afraid to be seen. Yolanda Price sat in a folding chair someone had brought for her, a blanket across her lap, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. There were others too, dozens of them. Every person Larry had met in those 6 months. Every victim whose name filled his notebook. Every family Judge Bruce had tried to erase. They had come to witness what justice looked like when it finally arrived. Jennifer Kim stood off to one side, looking at Larry like she still couldn't quite reconcile the homeless man she tried to help with the legend standing before her in a $1,000 suit. Larry stepped up to the podium, and the cameras swiveled to focus on him. For a moment he just stood there, looking at the faces of people who'd shared their last cans of soup with him, who'd taught him that dignity wasn't something you wore. It was something you carried inside, no matter what the world tried to take from you. 3 weeks ago, Larry began, his voice steady and clear. A corrupt judge was arrested in the courtroom where he'd spent years abusing his power. Judge West Bruce believed he was untouchable. He believed that wealth and position placed him above accountability. He was wrong. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. One of the reporters shouted a question, but Larry raised his hand gently. This morning, I'm here to announce that we're filing a federal class action lawsuit against Finch Development Corporation, the city of Henderson, and 12 co-conspirators who participated in what can only be described as state-sanctioned theft. Over the past 7 years, more than 300 families were illegally displaced from their homes. Properties were condemned on false pretenses. Code violations were fabricated. Families were terrorized, harassed, and criminalized for the sin of living in homes that developers wanted. Larry paused, letting the weight of those numbers settle over the crowd. The lawsuit seeks full restitution for every displaced family. We're demanding the return of seized properties. We're demanding compensation for emotional distress, lost wages, and the years of suffering these families endured. And we're demanding systemic reforms to ensure this can never happen again. Teresa's hand went to her mouth. Marcus's eyes were wet. Yolanda nodded slowly, as if she'd been waiting her entire life to hear those words. I know many of you are wondering why I did this, Larry continued. Why someone with a comfortable life would choose to sleep on concrete and document injustice instead of just reporting what I found and moving on. The answer is simple. My mentor, Judge Harold Chin, taught me that the law is only as strong as our willingness to defend it. He died trying to expose this corruption. The least I could do was finish his work. Larry's voice softened, became more personal. But I also did this because I needed to understand. For 18 years, I practiced law in glass towers, defending people who didn't need defending, winning cases that probably shouldn't have been won. I'd forgotten what justice actually means. Marcus, Teresa, Yolanda, he looked directly at them. You reminded me. You showed me that dignity isn't about what you own or where you sleep. It's about refusing to disappear when the world wants you gone. He straightened, his voice becoming formal again. To that end, I'm announcing the opening of the Haven Law Clinic, a non-profit legal practice dedicated to representing homeless individuals and families facing housing discrimination. The clinic will be funded entirely by my personal assets and by settlements from this lawsuit. We will provide free legal representation to anyone who's been told they don't matter because they don't have money. The crowd erupted in applause. Some people were crying openly now. A reporter pushed forward. Mr. Bowens, some are calling you a hero. I'm not a hero, Larry interrupted firmly. Heroes don't exist in courtrooms. Justice exists. Accountability exists. The rule of law exists. I simply decided to stop selling those principles to the highest bidder and start using them the way they were meant to be used, to protect people who can't protect themselves. He looked back at the courthouse, at the building where he'd been mocked and humiliated, where he'd sprung a trap 6 months in the making. Judge Bruce thought he could flush away human beings like they were garbage. He learned that even the people society ignores have voices. They have rights. And sometimes, they have a ghost who's willing to fight for them. Larry stepped back from the podium as reporters shouted questions. But he wasn't listening to them anymore. He walked down the steps toward Marcus, who stood there with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, and pulled Larry into an embrace that said everything words couldn't. Larry held his friend, because that's what Marcus was now, not a client or a victim but a friend, and felt something he hadn't felt in 18 years of practicing law. He felt like he'd finally won a case that actually mattered. Behind them, the courthouse doors stood open, waiting for Justice to walk through them again. And this time, Justice would be wearing tattered coats and carrying grocery bags, sleeping under bridges and sitting on cardboard. This time, Justice would look like the people who needed it most. If this story of justice, redemption, and never underestimating anyone moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you thought of Larry's incredible transformation. Did you see the twist coming? What moment hit you the hardest? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story, because we've got another tale coming that will leave you speechless. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, and sometimes justice wears a disguise. Drop a comment telling us, what would you do if you witnessed corruption like Judge Bruce's? We read every single comment and love hearing your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and we'll see you in the next story. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.